All right. Thanks for joining us, everybody. We are continuing our series on Success Leaves Clues, where we are currently analyzing prior United States presidents and kind of the attributes, the characteristics that made them successful. Today, obviously, we're talking about Ulysses S Grant. I think a quote that really kind of sums up everything that I've learned about him is his quote was, "If you see the president, tell him for me that whatever happens there will be no going. There will be no going back." So just kind of his commitment to completing the task. We're going to analyze kind of his strengths in spite of his flaws, his moral focus and commitment, along with just kind of a quiet competence that he had about his military leadership. And we're going to delve into all that and how it might be applicable to your life. We're going to be chatting today with Dr. Roger Hall. He's he's our co-host, he's a business psychologist, executive coach, public speaker, and multi-time author. And with that, we'll bring on Dr. Hall and chat about what I would say seems to me like an interesting gentleman by virtue of not being very interesting.
Yeah.
He didn't have the flair.
He had very little flair, and had it not been this convergence of the Civil War, the events of his life would have led him to being probably a failed businessman in Illinois, unremembered and perhaps unloved. So, except by his wife.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we'll get into the housekeeping stuff, but I think it's interesting. Two things. One, we've talked briefly about before, and that is, for those folks that don't necessarily think they're made to be great leaders, when we've talked about leaders that you wouldn't think were. And then in Grant's case, he was, it was all about timing, for him, like you mentioned. So I find that interesting, and I hope our audience will as well. So
I mean, I hope they find it encouraging as well.
yeah,
there is this idea about who you need to be in order to be a leader, and Grant really didn't have what we think of as having what a modern leader would be.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm excited to get into the details. Let's just do a couple of small housekeeping items here real quick before we do. For those of you that I haven't met, my name is Jared Lee. I'm the associate broker and team lead here at My Home Connection, also known as MHC Realty. Our sponsor, again, for the day is the perfect real estate business for those of you folks that want to grow your business in real estate. We've introduced, in large part with partnership with Dr. Hall, business coaching, life coaching, mentoring, and then some of the traditional things that you would expect out of a real estate team, lead generation, profit sharing, revenue sharing. We'd love to just chat with you about what all that means and answer any questions you might have. So with that, let's go ahead and bring Dr. Hall back in. And I think I mentioned to you, I love doing the research on some of these presidents. And I knew a little bit about Grant, and I was waiting for the, hey, this is that standout thing about him that separated him from everybody else. And it took a lot of digging. But I think he's interesting because he did some very interesting things, not being very interesting.
I love that. He did some very interesting things, not being very interesting. That is absolutely true.
Anyway, that was my summary or synopsis of my research.
No, it's a great summary.
Well, let's talk about kind of what it was that made him, I guess perseverance was one of the things I was going to put on the list here. And I came across a quote, and I couldn't quite verify that it was in his memoirs, but it was stated as if it was, but said, "The best leaders are not those who campaign for a job, but those who are given an assignment, accept it, and do it dutifully." And
Yes.
I just love that. I just think, leaders aren't the ones going out there in pursuit of power. They're not trying to fight for something and then prove to everybody that they can do it. They're just given a task and they get it done.
Yeah. I if your listeners don't know his story, he went to West Point from a not very, he didn't come from an aristocratic family. It was a very common family, and it was a way for him to get an education. And when he went to West Point, he was there with other generals from the Civil War. Civil War hadn't happened yet. It was still at that point one country. And Robert E. Lee was there, I believe, at the time. And Lee was pretty much at the top of his class. And lots of the other generals who went to the South were from Virginia and were at the top of their class. He had come from Illinois and really wasn't a very good student. He was exceptional as a horseman, and he was exceptional as a map reader. Those were the two things he was really good at. And you think, okay, so he can ride horses and read maps. So he's good at what? Horse orienteering?
Right.
Well, it turns out those were two incredibly valuable skills for Army tactics.
Yeah.
But if you trace his history, he was given positions, but none of them really remarkable. No one would say, "Oh, this is a standout leader." And he was desperately in love with his wife, and they went out to the West Coast, and he had a position there, and she went back to the Midwest. Her family was from Missouri, which was a slave state. He was from Illinois, which was a free state. And while he was in California, he took to excessive drinking, and he got drummed out of the Army. And it was like, you resign now or we're going to ruin your life. And so he resigned in disgrace. He went back to Illinois. His wife, who loved him back, came to Illinois with him. And he pretty much had to beg for jobs. And eventually his father helped him out. He had a part ownership in a business that was not very successful. And he was mostly just kind of this indolent nobody. His drinking was under control at that point because his wife was around. So he always felt better when she was there, it seems. But if you look at him, he was not an exceptional person. So if you don't know the history of the Civil War, the Union is getting their clock cleaned. I mean, Lee was an incredible strategist, and Lincoln had all of these awful generals. They would just march up and down in Washington, and he'd say, "When are you going to go out?" He goes, "Well, we got some more marching to do." And so, it was weeks and weeks and months of, preparation, and nothing ever happened. And so they'd go out to battle and they would just get destroyed. Mm-hmm. And it was during this point that they start calling up people who had been in the military, and they were taking pretty much, anybody who would come. Mm-hmm. And he had the opportunity to go back and serve the Union. So he did. It was the only thing that brought him out of obscurity. And as I said before we started the interview, had the Civil War not come, he would have died in obscurity, unknown, unremembered, and unloved by everybody but his wife. And so he comes back and he starts working his way up through the Western Campaign. Now, at that time, the Western Campaign meant what was happening in Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and in those areas. That was considered the West at that point. You and I are in Idaho, and at that point, Idaho wasn't even a state.
Right.
But we did have gold, and much of that gold went to the Union cause. And one of the reasons Idaho didn't get statehood until after the war. I don't know if you knew that or not.
I did
not.
You,
Jared?
That's very interesting. I knew we had a lot of gold, but I didn't realize it played that heavily into the...
A lot of it, and that was one of the reasons they held off, because Idaho had intended to join in the Confederacy had they been named as a state.
Interesting.
So, anyway,
yeah.
But the Western Campaign was, in Kentucky, Tennessee, Indiana, Illinois, and he was doing really well. And his skills as a horseman and a map reader made him an excellent tactician. And he was able, by looking at the maps, to intuitively figure out, okay, here's where we need to go. And he never campaigned for that job. He just got promoted by being successful. And Lincoln said, if I had more of, I'd like to have more of Grant's. And because he continued to succeed, he was eventually placed in charge of the entire Union Army. And so he never campaigned for the job. He just did his job.
Yeah.
And it's so different. And eventually he became president. And he was kind of dragged into that as well, because after Lincoln was assassinated, his vice president, who was a Democrat, and at the time, the president was from one party and the vice president was from the opposing party. So Lincoln, a Republican, when he was assassinated, Andrew Johnson was placed in the spot as the president. So Johnson didn't share any of Lincoln's views on slavery, on Reconstruction, all the plans that Lincoln had for reconstructing the South. Johnson wanted nothing to do with those.
But
He was
Grant
from Tennessee.
wanted the same thing, so he's like, if this is going to get done, I guess I get to do it.
I got to do it. Yeah. And everybody pretty much knew that Johnson was a drunk. That was the criticism of Grant. And Grant certainly was a heavy drinker at some phases in his life. But Johnson was just a completely reprobate drunk. And, he was really a failed president. And so Grant said, okay, I got to do it. And so they kind of drafted him into that position, which is,
Well,
I think,
enormously popular, right? I mean, he was
once he was there, yeah, he was enormously popular. He did a very good job. He very much advocated for the rights of our black citizens, the rights, as you correctly mentioned before we began the interview, for the Indian nations, because he respected them. That was not widely believed at the time, to respect people of different races, but he did respect them, and he wanted what was best for them. So we would not have had Reconstruction in the South if it wasn't for Grant pushing for it. And poll taxes and Jim Crow laws, they didn't happen in the South because there were federal troops in the South during Grant's administration. And it was actually a flourishing of elected black officials into the House of Representatives. And all of that, once the federal troops left after Grant was out of office, once that happened, then the poll taxes and then the Jim Crow laws and all of those horrible things sprung back up. But he had done a lot for Reconstruction that wouldn't have happened had he not been president, which goes back to that quote. He never campaigned for it, but you put a job in front of him and he did the job, which is a contrast to our modern presidents, who many of them from birth have wanted nothing more than to be president. And there was a quote from Alan Greenspan, who served with John F. Kennedy all the way up through George W. Bush. And somebody said, well, what do you have to say about them? And he said, well, they were all weird. There was something wrong with all of them. Every one of them was odd. There was only one semi-normal one. I love that quote, one semi-normal one.
Yeah.
And I've asked people to guess, and almost everybody guesses wrong, but the only semi-normal one was Gerald Ford.
Wow. And
Gerald Ford in that list, and the only president so far who never ran for president. So if you don't know the history, Nixon ran with Spiro Agnew. Spiro Agnew was kicked out of office because of income tax problems. Ford then was appointed as vice president. Then shortly thereafter, Nixon resigned because of the Watergate scandal. Mm-hmm. So Ford ascended to presidency. He's the only president in our history who didn't run for the office. So if you look at modern presidents, all modern presidents, if you want that job, there's probably something wrong with you.
Yeah.
Uh,
You're a little strange
they,
that you want that job.
right. They and
Why
some
would
of them
you?
have wanted it since they were children.
Yeah.
But Grant never had any aspirations for that. You put the job in front of him, he did the job, and he succeeded it, and he succeeded with it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think the power of what I saw in his resiliency or in his persistence in getting the job done under any condition was just amazing. I mean, he's just like, I referenced the quote earlier. He's like, hey, we're not going to give up. Not an option.
No, no, and I think people from the South would say he was a brutal general, and it was a war. And yeah, I think he bombed the heck out of places.
Yeah, well, he was just a brute force general, right? Like I'm coming, and there's nothing going to stop me. I'm not going to temporarily back off and revisit strategy or anything. I'm just forging ahead and kind of keep banging your head against that wall until there's a dent in it, type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, he is a great example of persistence. I mean, he understood what to do. He understood how his opponents would think and move, and he was able to plan for it. He wasn't Lee. Lee was a brilliant strategic general. Grant was not quite as good, but in terms of tactics, he knew how to do it. And Gettysburg was the big face-off.
Yeah.
And had Lee's army been able to come around Little Round Top, which was the end of the line, they could have come in behind and really decimated the Union Army. Would have taken that battle and perhaps the war in a very different direction.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that. If you're a person that just brute forces, that can work. And clearly Grant's an example of that. I think I heard numbers somewhat along the lines of, for every, 3 men that Robert E. Lee lost, Grant was losing 5. But Grant knew that he could replace some of those soldiers. So you had Robert E. Lee being very, strategic, methodical, and just winning through success in that way. And that's certainly a way a leader can move ahead. And obviously you'd want to save as many lives as you can. But sometimes another approach is just keep powering.
Yeah, and if you have the resources, you can win that way. There were more. The North was more populated, so there were more people to choose from. Mm-hmm. They had more money because they had a greater industrial base, less agricultural base, and so Lee had to work with what he had. And there were brilliant military minds in the South. And yeah, they got beat through brute force.
I'd like to think he knew that those resources were there and that strategy long term could prevail. I mean, maybe he was just blindly like, this is the only option I got. So this is.
Oh, you mean Grant?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think Grant came in so late at the game. It was desperate times, and so he had to fight back from a series of tremendous losses for the Union. So yeah, it's good that he had those resources, and it's good that those tactics and that strategy worked in that case. At least if you like the United States as it's currently composed.
Yeah. 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 Well, I did want to, I accidentally clicked this one, but I want to kind of go back to where you were talking about earlier that I think is very powerful for everybody to hear, because everybody has flaws. If you don't think you have a flaw, Dr. Hall will correct you, because everybody's got blind spots. So if you don't think you do, it's because you haven't seen it yet.
Yeah. I'm included in that. I recognize I have blind spots, and because they're blind spots, there's many that I don't know about yet.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Grant here is evidence, again, why he was an alcoholic, probably in large part because he was separated from the wife he really loved or whatever it was, and just never found, traction in the business world, and, just seemed to have a lot of failures and really never stood out. But he had this, what was that term I had heard? It was like a quiet confidence about him. He
Yeah.
just kind of exuded like failure's not an option. We've got this under control and we're going to win it. And apparently the men following him just, that resonated with him.
And it did. He was much, he's much the common man. He wasn't he wasn't a dandy. He didn't dress up, and he was pretty rough in the way he looked. He was not nearly as polished as Lee or some of the other Southern generals, or even many of the Northern generals. He couldn't shake the persistent rumors about his heavy drinking. And again, they were based in fact, so let's not sugarcoat it. He had trouble with booze in different periods of his life. Some periods were better than others, but he seemed to drink as a binge drinker. He would be a teetotaler, and then at some point he would just pound, and he'd get himself in trouble, and that's a tremendous flaw. But then on the other side, once he'd achieved some success, he was remarkably bad at choosing people to trust. He was such a man of honor. I think he just assumed everybody behaved honorably, and so he put his trust in people who were really scoundrels. And because of that, he got associated with bad people, lost a ton of money, and in the end of his life, he had to write his memoirs as a way to make sure his wife wasn't bankrupt. And and I guess one of the other things is, one of the complicating stories is, his wife's family were slave owners in Missouri, and he was not a slave owner in Illinois. And he had the option to live down there in safety. His father-in-law was going to offer him security and stability, and he just didn't want any part of it. So he operated on principles that cost him, that he could have had a different kind of life if he had gone against those principles. So he was a man with a strong moral code, and it cost him.
Yeah. Well, and I think that in part came from both his mom and his father, from what I understand, probably in larger part from his mom. But yeah, it's like I could forego those things that were, bred into me or taught into me, and then and go live a life of comfort. And obviously he opted, to stay on point with this,
Yeah, and it's interesting, and I'm glad you mentioned his mom, because his mom and Lincoln's mom, or stepmom, were central characters in their development. And just because we're talking about men doesn't mean there aren't women in these stories who are vitally important. We've talked about John Adams in the past, and the hero of that story is Abigail. And so they may not get the immediate press, but they're every bit a part of the story. And his basic foundation is a result of that parenting.
Yeah, well, I mean, even in Grant's case, if he didn't find the love of his life and he had alcohol problems, how much more do you think he could have had alcohol problems not having
Yeah,
a
yeah.
woman he absolutely loved and adored?
And who loved and adored him back.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and what to fight for, right? It's like, man, I got to make it home. Like
yeah.
we're gonna win because I got to make it home.
Right, right. And she's a very normal person. She wasn't a supermodel. She was just a woman he loved.
Didn't she
And
have like an eye issue or something like
she
that? They were
did.
trying
She
to get
did.
some
She had
surgery.
a lazy eye, and they never did the surgery. And um, so her physical appearance for many people was uncomfortable, but not to him. And it's like, so she would always make sure she was only photographed from one side in profile, so that that eye never made it into the pictures. But her physical appearance really didn't matter to him. I mean, he loved her. It's kind of a nice love story. Just
Yeah. Well, in my
that people,
research, and I don't know how accurate this is, but they had gotten to a point where they did have some money and could have had surgery for her eye, but he said, "I love you just the way you are," and she opted to not. Which,
to
that's a
not.
powerful love story. Yeah,
It is a powerful love story. Yeah.
yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. I'm trying to think if we missed anything. Oh, you know what? We did miss something on him. So, talk about perseverance, right? I think we touched on it briefly, but his last days, just powering through the cancer that he had to finish his books. I don't his memoirs. I don't think it was more than a handful of days after he completed them that he passed away. So that just speaks to I got to get the job done.
Yeah, we haven't mentioned it, but he replaced booze with cigars. And
Mm,
when he was a younger man, he didn't smoke, but then he began smoking cigars, and they believe his prodigious cigar smoking
mm,
contributed to his cancer. Um, but at the end of his life, he didn't have any money because he had been, he'd been swindled out of much of his money.
mm-hmm.
He was worried about his wife, and he was given a book contract, and he would bundle himself up because as people know, as they're beginning to fade, they get really, really cold. He'd bundle himself up and he would handwrite his
Wow.
memoirs. And he wrote until a couple days before he died. And as you mentioned, Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, stepped in to make sure that copies were sold and that Mrs. Grant would not be destitute. And
Yeah.
it was quite a bestseller.
Yeah, yeah. From what I understand, there's people that have recommended that it be required reading in school because it was just, a book of the ages. And I think in today's monies, I think it was about a $500,000 made off of his memoirs. But in today's monies, I think it was like 16 million or something like that. If you were, that's just the brief research that I did on it. But here's a guy. From what I understand, he said it was like. Swallowing hot lead, like molten lead, when he was swallowing. So he's, getting through this book to take care of his family financially to complete these memoirs. Like, man,
And in constant pain and
yeah,
willing to do it rather than dope up on morphine.
yeah,
He powered through it for the benefit of his family. I mean, he really is an admirable character despite his many flaws and addictions.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I just think of, I'm a big why guy, and I'm just thinking of him with his whys. Why is he going to win this war? Because of his moral code and his
Mm-hmm.
commitment to doing things. And now he's found in his, in his life, in his time, he's being asked to marshal the skills that he has that are oddly interesting, kind of obscure. Like you said, like,
Yeah.
oh, you're a good horse rider and you know maps. Like, okay.
Okay. What does that do?
Yeah, it's like, oh, now I get to use them. But then you put
Uh-huh.
that, in combination with his like perseverance and fortitude. I mean, we don't keep track of how often we swallow, but I bet if we did and consider it's like swallowing molten lead, you know, for any period of time, there's not a lot of people that would do that. But here's a guy that's got to take care of his family before he leaves. I don't know. It's just interesting to me. But
It, and again, I think in our in our paparazzi culture, it's really easy to idolize what we can see with a camera, but it's harder to memorialize and look up to character qualities because they're just harder to measure.
yeah, yeah,
Money is easy to measure, beauty and good looks are easy to measure, but having good moral character, despite your many flaws, it's a tough thing to measure. How do you measure that?
yeah. Well, and it's even more interesting with him because he did get aligned with other people that were flawed that he couldn't see because he didn't think like that. And
Yeah,
for it to bring him down, not only bring him down when he was alive, but even decades, many, many years after his death, there was just, I mean, it's taken a lot of time to kind of rehabilitate the true, reputation, history of the man that he was.
Yep.
I don't know that I ever read anything that he did to counter that stuff other than write his memoirs, which was clearly a powerful, you know,
Yeah, it's a powerful testament to what really happened. But it's easy. It's easy for people in the media, even then, to spin a story the way that they wanted to, and they're still doing it today.
yeah, yeah. Well, and there was a lot of reasons, and we won't get into all that details because there's a lot of politics around it. But there was a lot of reasons why those narratives had to be spun for that time in different directions.
Sure.
Unfortunate to him, but I am glad that we can get on something as simple as a podcast episode to talk about his life and hopefully at least communicate as best we can with the research that we've done as accurately as can about the life of the man that I just think there's some definitely undisputed things that make him one of our most powerful leaders. He clearly had a profound impact on the Civil War and then the direction that the country went during his presidency. Even though he wasn't a super good president, he even in death, what was there? There was like a million people celebrating his death in New York. How does somebody at that time bring a million people together?
Be, because they believe he continued to save the Union and do something that was terribly important. I think maybe one of the things he represents is a principle that you and I have talked about a lot, which is I control my character, which are the moral choices I make to limit the excesses of my personality.
Yeah.
Other people own my reputation.
Yeah.
I own my character because I'm in control of that. My reputation is what other people say about me. I don't own that.
Yeah.
And, his life is an example of that, of generally good character.
Mm-hmm.
But it didn't fit a narrative, so it got spun differently. Yeah. And we can't have control over our reputation. So if we can go to sleep every night knowing I behaved with good character, and the people who are closest to me know me and love me for who I really am, not my reputation, then that should be good enough.
Yeah, yeah. Well, speaking of character, one of the things I found out during my research that was just very intriguing to me was, he wasn't. He still, loved and appreciated the people that were on the other side of the war. The Confederacy. He didn't dislike them or hate them. He just felt like they were wrong, and so his approach to the war wasn't, "Hey, I hate and despise you." It's, "Hey, I've got to do something as per this cause on my side." And it was demonstrated in large part because of his request to have his pallbearers be equal, Union and Confederacy. And I was just like, wow, that's in death, he's still trying to unite
the country.
The country.
Yeah.
It was amazing.
And it, and I'll make a statement. Wouldn't it be nice if we were all trying to unite the country?
Yeah. Yeah. Even if don't all have the same, beliefs.
We're not going to have all the same priorities, and we're not going to have all the same values. I hope we have enough of the same values to continue on as a unified country. But people who disagree with me, like Grant, I don't think they're evil. I just think they're wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's okay. Fortunately, we're not in a war where we're killing each other, but certainly,
thankfully,
sometimes we sure seem to act that way by saying we'd like people to die or whatever, and that's just not right either. But anyway, I just hope we've done Grant some justice here and sharing what we know, and I hope folks that are listening to this episode can go, what, maybe there is a time, right? Where does it come from? I was made for a time such as this. I'm struggling
from the book of Esther.
Yes.
In the Bible. Yeah. Born for such a time as this. Yeah.
Clearly that was Grant, right? I mean, any other time.
Yep.
Wouldn't have.
If he had been around today, nobody'd ever know about him.
Yeah.
He'd be in some wide place in the road in southern Illinois, trying to make a living at a convenience store.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, let's wrap things up here, but let's make sure folks know how to get a hold of your resources.
Yeah.
Let me try to toggle here. There we go. Where can we get a hold of you, Dr. Hall?
Probably best way is my website, drrogerhall.com, drrogerhall.com. On it, you can find out about my books, Staying Happy, Being Productive, DIY Brain, and Expedition, which you and I just talked about before we went on today, is now available on Amazon. I'm delighted to be able to say that. And my upcoming book is called DIY Leader Brain, about how the neurobiology of relationships in human relationships.
Awesome.
If you'd like to take my online course, Freak Out, that's available on the website as well. And fairly soon, the course Expedition will be on there that goes along with the accompanying book Expedition.
Excellent, excellent. Well, all really good stuff. I was just trying to find a place at which we could kind of wrap things up here. But again, I just so appreciate your time, your insight into these presidents and talking through kind of the things that made them successful. My hope is that folks that are listening to this go, you know what, that resonates with me. That's a characteristic. And we all have them, right? I think we've all stated numerous times that we seriously, significantly underestimate our leadership abilities because we don't know if we had them. And I don't know if I've mentioned on an episode before, but I had heard that the average person is going to have about 10,000 opportunities to be a leader in their lifetime.
I don't know that statistic. I'm not surprised.
I thought it was pretty powerful. And what you've talked about, and I'm going to probably butcher this a little bit, but it's anybody that looks up to you, that is inspired by you, motivated by you. That's a leadership opportunity.
Yes.
And for the average person to not give themselves credit for 10,000 opportunities, man, that just kind of hurts my heart that you wouldn't.
Step up.
Yeah, step up. Yeah. Know that even when you're not paying attention, you're being looked at as a leader.
Yeah, somebody's watching.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, with that, we'll wrap things up. Thanks again, Dr. Hall, and we'll wish everybody a blessed one. Take care.
Thank you.